Today here we're gathering to talk about SDG 16 on peace, so peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. And I would just like to briefly mention particularly something that is repeated often at the UN, and I think it was first quoted by former Deputy Secretary General Jan Eliasson, which he says, and I quote, "There's no peace without development, and there's no development without peace, and there's no lasting peace or sustainable development without respect of human rights and the rule of law." So this interconnectivity of SDG 16 is essential to the success of the entire SDG framework. But often people say that SDG 16 is one of the hardest SDGs to measure. And this panel discussion particularly will focus on the challenges and strategies adopted in measuring progress on SDG 16 on crisis contexts, and how creative thinking and innovative partnerships are essential to measure progress. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our moderator, Mrs. Katy Thompson, Head of Rule of Law, Security, Justice, and Human Rights at the Crisis Bureau of UNDP.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Peace Stream. Thank you for coming to the Peace Stream, because not only is SDG 16 our favorite goal, and peace is our favorite part of it, especially peace combined with justice. So we're really happy to be here today. So we have got a great panel. What we want to talk to you about a little bit is some of the challenges of looking at data and measuring progress of Sustainable Development Goal 16, especially in countries that have been affected by crisis or conflict, but also to look at some interesting steps that are being taken, and to hear from our, especially from Colombia, from our national partner who's here. She's here to talk about specifically about her work, and to put a bit of the field reality, if you like, into the conversation. So we won't necessarily be going into the micro detail of the data. We're going to be talking about the systems by which we generate and manage data, and how that can be used by policymakers. So I work for the United Nations Development Programme. We are a rather large part of the UN system, which is really field-based. So most of our staff are working in developing countries, developing and delivering programs with our national partners, who are Ministries of Justice, National Statistics Offices, NGOs, civil society groups in various engagements around governance, justice, rule of law, transparency, anti-corruption, and a wide range of other things. So without further ado, because actually it's quite a short panel, we have only 45 minutes. I'm not sure if we're going to have time to move to the audience, but so we'll try and make the most of it. So I'm going to first of all turn to our first panelist, Sylvana Peña Saffon. She is a technical advisor with the National Planning Department of Colombia, and they work within a multidimensional government directorate which focuses on justice, security, and governance. So she's designing and implementing public policy on access to justice, and she's formulating a part of the team for the current National Development Plan that's under development right now. So, Sylvana, it's really great to have you here. So we are just all ears to hear a little bit about what your experiences is in Colombia, and what steps you are taking with your government to measure access to justice. And tell us a little bit how those areas that have been really affected by violence, what are the challenges there, and what you can do to look specifically at measuring justice in those locations.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. In Colombia specifically, and particularly in measuring access to justice, as previously said, measuring justice is very difficult. So the biggest challenge that we've encountered in measuring access to justice is that we don't know what the actual needs are in terms of population. We don't know what the population really needs in matters of accessing justice. So traditionally, the only data that we've had is administrative records. So it's just what the judge houses and the courts are reporting on how many cases are being solved. But we don't know if those many cases that are being solved are the actual or the only ones that need to have a solution in conflicts throughout the country. So as you all know, Colombia recently signed, I hope that you all know, we recently signed a peace agreement after a very long conflict, after about 60 years of conflict throughout the entire territory. So right now we are at a transitional state where we are implementing the peace agreement, and we are looking for different tools in how to measure how we are, getting better. There is another specific characteristic in Colombia regarding the territory, and is that the country is very diverse in itself. Not only socioeconomical differences, but the territory itself, the geography is very difficult, and to reach every single part of the country sometimes can be very tricky. So as you might imagine, with these two characteristics, the conflicts that our society have are very diverse as well. And just by measuring administrative records, that doesn't tell us much on how people are being, having problems solved or accessing justice. So right now, we shifted from just the offer from the government to an individual and citizen perspective. We are now asking the citizens what they need, what are their conflicts, and we are trying to look at which are the best strategies to solve them. So firstly, we designed a legal needs survey. And with the legal needs survey, we try to reach most of the territory to have accurate estimations on which were the conflicts that people were having the most, and to realize that justice and access to justice is a very complex system, a very complex process that you can't just tackle with one simple strategy. So when collecting this data, we realized, for example, that the legal need that most people declared was in terms of health and health access. So around 25% of the people that answered the survey were having issues in accessing the health system, and their problems weren't being solved throughout the entire justice system. So what we did next was take those results plus the administrative records and try to enhance them and take the best of both worlds. So we created the Access to Justice Index. And what we're trying to do with this index is have accurate estimations on what the different dimensions that we acknowledge constitute access to justice are working throughout the entire territory. So Colombia is distributed in 29 different departments, or what you would understand as states. So we have a lot of different departments and with very different characteristics. So the index, what it's trying to analyze is in each dimension that we think constitutes access to justice, how these dimensions are working throughout the entire 29 territories. So we can understand how population is moving, how and which conflicts are generating here. So we can establish strategies and to design specific justice models for each territory so people can actually solve their problems specifically. We understood access to justice as a multidimensional process, a very complex one, where different actors and different institutions intervene. So we designed 6 main dimensions, each dimension constituted by 4 different variables. And these 4 different variables and each dimension can be measured throughout the entire territory. So we can, as I was telling you, design different models of justice. So for example, Colombia has a very large rural territory. And traditionally, most of the conflicts have been around property of land and the economic activities that you can develop throughout the land of the country. So as you might infer, most of these conflicts need judges that are focused on rural aspects of the conflict. So with this index, what we're trying to do is know what the different kinds of judges or mediators or referees for different conflicts need to be located where specifically in each part of the country. So I'm just going to mention very quickly the 6 dimensions that interact and end up determining whether the person has an effective solution for a specific conflict in a timely and efficient way. First, we have the favorable environment dimension, the legal capacity, legal assistance, access to institutions, fair procedure, and compliance with decision. So this is what we're working on right now. Specifically right now, we've encountered also a lot of issues with the legal needs module and the index, because we're still working on enhancing and strengthening the collection of information. So when we collected the data from the legal module for the legal survey, we had about 5,000 responses with the survey that declared a legal need. So it's still a very small sample for a 48 million population. So right now, what we are trying to do is to redesign the survey and make it a little bit more understandable, comprehensible for the entire population, so we can have more data collected. And so we will be able to strengthen the index and actually have information on how to apply public policy and ensure access to justice.
Thank you. Super interesting. So I'd like to do some follow-ups, but what I actually think might be better is if we hear the spectrum and then we come back to you. Also, because Anna, who's going to present next, is going to talk around the complementary perspective of looking at security and armed violence reduction, an important component of your index, actually.
Yes.
And for us, an important component of reinforcing the rule of law as a whole, particularly important in post-conflict contexts. So Anna Alvazzi is a senior advisor at Small Arms Survey, which is an NGO, or a very well-respected NGO and think tank based in Geneva. And she's been very active in working with the UN Office for Drugs and Crime and other UN agencies on research and programs around small arms and armed violence reduction, and monitoring of programs that are seeking to address circulation of small arms and to ensure violence can be reduced. So we look forward to hearing from you. I know you're going to speak a little bit about the role of civil society in this work, but it would be great to hear your perspectives also on how this type of data collection can be used from a security perspective and be brought together.
Thank you very much. And thank you also for introducing the monitoring word, because this is the key. In Geneva, at the Small Arms Survey, as you can imagine, we were born with the aim of measuring all aspects related to small arms and their impact. The extra challenge is that arms are an issue for all countries in the world. So we go back to the spirit of Agenda 2030, that is universal. It's not only something that should concern developing countries or countries in crisis. We have to make sure that this work is well done everywhere. And when we talk about arms, we have to make sure that everything is done to prevent diversion into illicit markets and to prevent the negative impacts. So arms per se are not something illicit, and all aspects related to arms trade also need to be carried out with respect to sustainable development. So much of the work that civil society NGO organization like us is doing is trying to read the agenda and connecting the dots to make sure that on the one hand there is availability of data, not only those that don't exist. So we develop indicators, we develop data collection initiatives, but we also help, especially government counterparts, in understanding why this is important and understanding how to use them. For example, one of the projects that we are carrying out at the moment is an initiative that is focusing on a group of 5 African countries, where we sat down with them in cooperation with the African Union Commission in identifying firearms indicators, which are the indicators that are relevant for firearms beyond the global indicator for target 16.4 of the SDGs. That is, let's say, aspirational. It's an indicator that doesn't measure really the reduction of the illicit arms flows, but it's an indicator that measures how government agencies improve their capacity to detect and intercept illegal weapons. So this speaks a lot about the challenges of many of the indicators for Goal 16 that are measuring negative things. So bad things require good statistics, because otherwise it's very easy just to reduce the numbers and look much better. So big challenge for administrative offices who really need to avoid the trap of improving their capacity and looking bad because they are capable of measuring more. So a lot of education around this to be able to read the data. At the same time, what we do is also to accompany the measurement with the interpretation of the data that is available. So what is behind me should be here, yes, is analysis that we do on a regular basis of data on violent deaths. That is all violent deaths. It is homicides and it is conflict-related deaths. So it's quite a challenging exercise that if you look at it through the lens of the SDG indicators, it combines the indicators 1611 and 1612. And looking at the rates over time, you can see that lately, over the past couple of years, there has been a deterioration. So we were used to talk about declining homicides rates, declining conflict rates. Unfortunately, this is not the case anymore. So a projection that you can see in the middle of that shows that business as usual, if nothing changes, we are not going to get any better in 2030. And there is a need now to demonstrate what works, what are the policies and programs that work in reducing armed violence and in bringing back this measurement on track. So we see the role for civil society quite as a useful glue to make sure that all the aspects that are embedded in Agenda 2030, including leaving no one behind, including gender, including making sure that there is an interpretation broader than the global indicators, development of national indicators, looking at unofficial statistics. For example, there is the SDG 16 Data Initiative, that is a group of civil society organizations that join forces in sharing relevant data on aspects of various targets of Goal 16. All these things are a sort of watchdog function that we do with a friendly approach. It's not really to be bad, but to support countries to be able to reach these goals.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you for highlighting the challenges of what lies ahead between now and 2030. It's something I should have introduced at the beginning of really the fact that this 2030 is imminent. And this complexity that you both talked about, the combining of quantitative and qualitative data, the engagement of civil society as a kind of accountability measure, the challenges of access for people who are marginalized that you're dealing with through your surveys. These are extremely tough technical pieces to overcome, let alone to then use that data to input into policy-making processes. And all of it assumes the government that is unified and functional and budgeted and unaffected by external factors or endogenous conflict factors. So this sort of sums up the scale of the project that's before us. And thank you also for emphasizing universality, particularly important, especially as we sit here in a country that also needs to make progress on many of these elements. And I come from a country that needs to make significant progress also on these pieces. So very much on our concern. So thank you. I'm going to turn to Patrick, who's endeavoring to achieve gender balance on our panel. And not succeeding.
Accounting for free.
Yeah, but thank you anyway for trying.
I'm the token man.
It's the answer for years of the other way around. So Patrick is a research director at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. It's a really important initiative that looks at work that measures and understands peace building and resilience measures in very hard-hit conflict countries, extensive work in Liberia and Central African Republic, and in DRC, which you're going to talk to us about today. I'm intrigued by your background because I understand from your CV that you're actually a medic by historically.
Quite actually.
Okay, so you can tell us a little bit about that, but he's also a professor at Harvard Medical School and is looking with HHI and looking at how resilience, peace building, and social cohesion can be measured within these contexts, in particular on DRC and CAR. So I'm really intrigued to hear more about that, hear more about what your initiative is doing and how you can support local partners to be making progress on these goals through the work that you're doing. Thanks.
In 5 minutes.
In 5 minutes, please.
And the list of things I wanted to say has just tripled hearing my colleagues there, but I'll try to maintain it to 2 points. One is briefly talking about what we do, and then talking about what I think it means and some of the lessons we have learned in that process. Just for the very quick background, I'm actually an engineer, an agriculture engineer by training.
Even more confusing.
So yes, it is confusing, but so you see everything leads to peace at some point for me at least. The things that has been fascinating for me, I've been very lucky to be able to work in many countries doing mixed methods research, trying to understand how communities affected by violence are impacted, how they rebuild themselves, what the process looks like for reconstruction. And the DRC and Central African Republic are the places where I've probably delved the deepest into measuring peace and trying to understand what it means from the perspective of the population. Now, a lot of that work has been just old-fashioned legwork. It's about contacts. It's about going to communities, going to individuals, doing interviews. I was here listening this morning. There are tons of fascinating new ways of measuring things, and I'm involved in some of them. But in the end, you do need to talk to people. You need that contact to really understand the context, and that's what we've been doing. But we've done it in a way. I think what we've been able to achieve was one, just collecting data in situation of conflict itself is challenging. How do you do it? How do you do surveys when there's no population data? How do you know work when people are on the move? How do you deal with hard to reach population? Well, the methods are improving and there's ways of addressing that. And through technology, we're able to reduce the cost of doing that. Even in-person surveys, the cost, of course, will be higher than a cell phone-based survey, but the richness of the data justifies it. And so there are methods to reduce the cost. And for us, what was also key was to try to reduce as much as possible the extractive component of that work. Try to really engage with communities, not only as a way to gather information, but as a way to feed information, to reflect on what that means, and gather around results to discuss policy. And I would say that's the fourth thing that we've been able to achieve in a somewhat innovative way, was to create that policy space, create that space where actors that don't necessarily want to talk to each other are willing to sit with us just to look at data, and then try to develop that kind of evidence-based decision-making and try to reflect on a somewhat, data is never neutral, but that's what we strive to do, is try to present people, okay, this is what the situation is on the ground, what happens next? How are we going to do or address some of the findings? And again, it would take the entire session to go even in just one example of what that means. But what we've learned in doing that work is first the need to go beyond diagnostic. And one of the things about measuring the SDGs is, okay, sure, let's take, for example, we need to know whether victims report crimes. That's great, we need to measure that, but why don't they do it? What are the factors that prevent them from doing it? Is it the same in the north or in the south? Is it the same for men or for women? So we need to really go beyond diagnostic to try to understand what is the dynamic behind it, and then go into the prescriptive. That is, what can we do about it? What are the actionable factors that we can act on to try to improve whether people report or not crimes? And that's just one sub-indicators of a list of indicators for SDG 16, but it means that for each of these measures, there are hundreds of questions that we can ask, and that frankly needs to be answered. The second thing that we've learned through this work is that we need to be granular. As I just said, if you're trying to understand why, you need to understand on a very local level what are the variations. Why is it different in one community than in the other one? Which also means you need to be inclusive. You need to think about what are the different constituents, what are the different populations that you're talking to, and how might their experience be different from others. And finally, and that's really what was, to me, fairly new in the work in the Congo and Central African Republic, because we managed to do longitudinal surveys. So idea of being able to continuously collect data and bring new data was essential, because in some ways that's what created that policy space. That's what created the opportunity to engage in a continuous manner with people involved in policy decision or in programmatic decision. And creating what I call, I guess, data advocacy position. That is, we don't come with a policy agenda, we come with a data agenda. We come to say, this is what the measures are. Now let's reflect based on that evidence. So thank you to UNDP for supporting some of that work and for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. Thanks, Patrick. So I'm going to ask Aparna to pick up, because Aparna is going to discuss in a similar vein the challenges in Somalia. So we have a rather interesting program in UNDP with the national authorities in Somalia. And Aparna, who is a policy specialist in the rule of law, security and human rights team that I'm also in UNDP, is working to support that. She has extensive experience in supporting rule of law and access to justice programs globally, and has been really involved in advocacy and support to Goal 16 and to reporting on Goal 16 in the last couple of years with my colleague Alex, who is here, over here, and they've been doing some fabulous work on reporting, which was shared this year at the High-Level Political Forum. So I'm singing her praises because she's in my team, but also because she's a fabulous policy specialist. So Aparna, tell us about Somalia and the challenges that they're facing.
Yeah, thanks, Katie, and thanks to Bloomberg for letting us host this panel, which has been really interesting. I think Patrick said a lot of things that I also wanted to raise. So I'm talking, as Katie mentioned, about the experience that UNDP has in Somalia. We're working with the Ministry of Planning, Ministry of Justice, and Somalia is quite decentralized, so many of the federal member states as well directly in terms of monitoring progress on SDG 16. We also work with a number of UN actors through the Global Focal Point Arrangement on Rule of Law. And what we're trying to do with this initiative is really trying to see how we can work together to measure this progress over time. But as Patrick mentioned, the challenges in a context like Somalia, which is a fragile and crisis-affected context, are many. So first of all, there's the issue of baseline data. There's very little baseline data that's available. What data is available is quite patchy. Oftentimes, the security situation doesn't allow collection of data in many places. There's very little panel data available. So even when you have data on a particular issue, it's only from one point in time. You don't see what happens. So you can't really measure progress over time. And then there's a real issue around coordination. So while some agencies may collect data on a specific topic, they're less willing to share data, or there's issues around the sensitivity of the data. So there's concerns around being able to share and to have a holistic picture of what's happening on the ground. And then finally, I think Anna also raised this, and Patrick, the issues of capacities on data management, data collection are quite a bit of a challenge. And this is in context where, when you can do training around data literacy, but there are actually quite a bit of challenges around, computer literacy itself, or in many cases, when we went to do training around data management, the police who are collecting data on Goal 16 issues are saying, well, actually, we want to learn to read and write. And so these are the challenges, and these are the contexts in which we're working. So I spoke to some of my colleagues in Somalia, and there was a couple of points that we wanted to share from the 1-year experience we have in trying to pull together this initiative around Goal 16. And one is the need to go, while we have the global indicators and it's important to measure against them, I think the point Patrick was also making is that we need to have a more holistic understanding of what's happening around those indicators. So really trying to look at perception data, looking at what actually is happening on the ground, and so for that we need to look at the community perceptions of the police, the trust in the police, the trust in the formal courts, and the extent to which people are actually using these systems. And that means investing in collecting more qualitative data as well, alongside the quantitative data. The second is to really manage expectations, particularly around timelines when working in contexts that are fragile and conflict affected. There's a lot of investment that needs to go and time that needs to go into building up capacities, but also in terms of relationship building, because there needs to build a trust that the data that is shared is secure, and that people feel comfortable in having a coordinated function in collection of data and management of data. And then I would say the other important element is around partnerships with government, civil society, and other actors as well. And it's easy to say that, and at the global level, we're definitely trying to do a lot of that work. For example, through the Global Alliance on Reporting on SDG 16, where we're working with private sector, civil society, and with governments on reporting on SDG 16. But in the context such as Somalia, oftentimes there may be reluctance, a lack of trust in the government, for example, or in the security forces. We had a situation where, one NGO was not willing to share the data for fear of what will happen to that data. Another case where you need to really go behind the what the data you've collected is saying. So if we're looking at perceptions of trust in the police, we had a very positive response from one of the areas in Somalia where actually the police are quite heavy-handed. So then the question becomes, what is the data saying? Is it that people are reporting because they're fear of what will happen to them if they give a negative report to the police? Or is it because actually there is a positive sense of how the police is functioning in that area? So there's a lot of questions of what that data is saying that needs to be looked at. And then the other and final point that I will just make is around is a lot of what we're looking at is at the formal systems. And in many contexts, like in Somalia, we need to look at, if we're looking at justice and security, we need to look at traditional systems as well. And often that is not captured through formal processes. And then in many cases, in the case of Somalia, the state doesn't have control in all parts of the territory. So in those cases, how is it that you're able to actually measure delivery of services when services aren't being delivered, or they're being delivered through alternative means such as Al-Shabaab in Somalia? So these are questions that we don't have answers to, but they are in fragile contexts. You need to look and try to unpack what that means as well when you're looking at the data. Maybe just one last point, Katy, I know. So is really to emphasize the importance, and Patrick also mentioned this, about investing in capacity development of systems on the ground and the data infrastructure on the ground, because a lot of times there's a lot of investment in general capacity building of justice and security systems, but without putting in place investment in measurement of how they're doing, it's very difficult to have an understanding of the progress being made, both in terms of evidence-based policy making, but also in terms of accountability for the international actors that are working there, accountability of the state in terms of making progress. So there's a real need to make sure that we are investing in collecting that data.
Thanks, Aparna. It's a race to the finish line with a panel, and I just want to turn back to the colleagues on my right. I'm going to ask you, maybe, if you were advising the international community made of multilateral civil society and national partners now, just two things that you would recommend needed to be done to enable and support national partners to use evidence, not to necessarily generate, but to be open and receptive to be using data and to be able to interpret that and to inform their own policy making, which is the next step after you've got the data. What would be the top two things you would recommend to enable that to happen, given what you're seeing in practice?
What I would recommend from the Colombian perspective is that we need to, even before using the data, we need to ensure that the data is up to date. And we need to collect it periodically. Because in Colombia, for example, as I was telling you, the legal needs survey took place in 2016, and we haven't been able to apply it again. So we're redesigning it, and we are applying it again next year. But we are going to have 3 years of missing information. So if we are able to have this information, we need to show them specifically how we're using it information and how in the territory is being effective and the use is actually worth the time.
So it's about staying relevant to the policymakers.
Yes.
The data needs to be generated fast and accurate enough to stay relevant as they're making decisions, which are in the end political, their decisions, right?
Yes, because the data, I mean, it tells us a lot of things. It's just not random numbers. So it just helps you understand reality in a whole different perspective. So yes, I think being relevant.
So Anna, are all governments open to this data?
The point is, as you said, okay, there is a lot that could be done to open to new technologies, to innovation, to start advancing on how to get to this, what you say, more updated, more timely data. But governments, we are doing this experiment in many countries. We are creating this space, we call it this space, to talk to each other. There are government agencies who produce the data that is relevant to another agency who absolutely don't know anything about the existence of this data. And this is an eye-opener. It's something that is really creating new opportunities and obviously knowing about the big picture. We are not there. We are here talking about Agenda 2030. We are preaching the converted, I'm afraid, because really to filter and reach the field, explaining the big picture of Agenda 2030, the alignment of agendas, the possibility to talk about women, peace and security, arms control, and Agenda 2030 at the same time. All these things, they are not there yet.
So this is about bringing together in whole of government approaches to look at sort of interdisciplinary efforts to solve problems. Yeah. Which is actually very uncommon. It's a phenomenon that's very uncommon, actually, both here in Europe and also in developing worlds, and actually in bureaucracies in general. Yeah. We tend to work in silos.
On topics, they may focus on topics.
So that's an interesting methodological challenge for those of us working with governments to get them to think more creatively about using this data once it's relevant. So turning to colleagues on the left and thinking about what we've just said, and in particular about the principle of leave no one behind, and how, let's assume we have some efforts towards relevant data, some efforts towards being able to understand and apply the data, and the government somewhat open to whole of government approaches to using it. How do we tackle the issue of the most marginalized and not just measuring their situation, but actually changing their situation? How can data assist us, and what would be your top 2 recommendations in terms of seeing change in that respect?
So I had 5 minutes to prepare my response to the previous question.
Yes. Now you have
I'll try to frame
90 seconds.
I'll try to frame the same recommendation. No, I'm not joking. I think the same applies in that the first one is, compared to where we were 15 years ago, we first have to recognize that it's amazing. The demand and the opportunities, not only to collect data, but to get attention around data is huge. Things have changed dramatically. Yeah. But in some part, it's been driven by indicators, evaluation, and having one data point, and it is time to move a little bit beyond that. Now, nobody wants to be evaluated, and it's good that M&E has driven a lot of these efforts, but now we need to really kind of go towards data for dialogue, data for evidence to discuss and policies, and that requires the type of inclusivity that we're discussing now. It requires, again, that understanding of what are the experience of these different groups. So we need to go beyond just having a benchmark and the specific indicators towards more of a dialogue and understanding of different experience and different groups. But in order to have a dialogue, we need to have stakeholders. And so the second recommendation for me would be, it needs to be open. The results have to be open. Too many places we see gatekeepers around data. I'm not talking about raw data, but even aggregated data. Even just results are just not always available, but it's also gatekeeper on who gets to collect data, who gets to get information. I'm privileged to work at a university, and in every country where we work very closely to universities, but in many countries they are absent from the dialogue. They are absent from the discussion around peace, and they are key actors that have legitimate role to play in statistics, in the collection of data. And the third recommendation, because there were only 2 that was asked, but is investment. In the end, most of these places, the decisions, the resources are scarce, so it's difficult to decide, let's spend money on data, but that is really how you get to better spend the few resources that you have.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the last point you made, and that's very much around I think a lot of times the data collection efforts that happen by the UN system or by governments or civil society, it's all disparate. And what really needs to happen is, rather than duplicating efforts, which often happens, really find a way to have a coordinated approach across these different actors in collecting data in the country. And that can help to have a shared understanding. Of course, there are many challenges around that, but I think that's where your point around dialogue would be very important. But on your question on leaving no one behind, Katy, I think it's really important to connect the discussion around statistics with the discussion around human rights. And I think that's where, if you look at the lens of who is being left behind, if you look at it from a human rights lens, I think that really helps with the analysis of the data that's coming out, or even trying to identify what issues and priorities need to be looked at the country level. And certainly there are initiatives of national human rights institutions and national statistics offices trying to work together in different parts of the world and different regions. I think there needs to be a more closer alignment of the two agendas or two efforts around statistics and data and human rights.
Thanks. So I have 1 second to sum up, which is, so what we've heard is our data collection needs to stay relevant, it needs to stay multidimensional, it needs to interpret the needs of all different subsections of the communities or different geographical areas, with the understanding that the results may be very different depending on which parts of any setting we're looking at. But apart from the technical angle, all of this needs to be infused with values, and values of transparency and accountability and inclusion and multiple stakeholder approaches, and an emphasis on process and on helping policymakers to use that data and to help ordinary communities to understand their data, to hold the governments to account. So the data is critical, but the values are particularly important. And I think that's a critical message from this panel. I want to add that I think the conversation always is based on the idea that we assume good intent on the part of the politicians. And I would just put this into the frame that in order to hold the politicians to account for all of those measures that we just discussed, we need a stronger emphasis on accountability, in particular also on the human rights dimension. And I don't think we've cracked that nut. Will be parts of, I'm sure, what will be addressed in 2030 and hopefully before. But thank you so much. It was great to be in front of such a actually young, you all look really young from up here, and diverse panel. And I'm sorry that it's so short, we don't have time to exchange, but we're all around for the rest of the day, and thanks for your time.